The Sundered Doctrine dungeon in Destiny 2 is out, and today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on this latest dungeon experience. This is not a guide, and it will include spoilers, both in the video on screen as well as the topics of discussion, so this will be your one and only warning to avert your eyes and ears if you are still hoping for a blind experience going into the dungeon yourself. Sundered Doctrine finds us flying back into Savathun's throne world to investigate Rolk's pyramid ship, due to reports of dread activity inside. Not sure how they slipped past the Hidden or anyone else on our team, since the ship has been under surveillance by the Vanguard since our initial encounter with Rolk in the Vow of the Disciple raid. Maybe we'll figure out how that happened later. But one of the starkest differences in revisiting the ship is the environmental shift that has happened here. It makes sense that since we space magicked Rolk out of the universe, the ship, having been crashed and locked away in Savathun's throne world, has fallen into a state of disrepair. Where we were once invited into the ship by Rolk in all of his arrogance and shown the absolute best parts of it as he called us to him in a final showdown, we are now left with something very different here. The ship has been left unattended, unprotected. And in the absence of Rolk and his ilk, it is clear that the bog of Savathun's throne world is seeping in. Gone are the clean, articulate spaces of Vow of the Disciple. That order is no longer present. What we have here is like an archaeological dig site, remnants of development and civilization long past. Even more questions about what Rolk had been doing with his experiments on the hive worms. We see several examples in this dungeon that it wasn't simply worms born in captivity on the ship here, but we actually climb and scale up the trunks of several mature, I assume full-grown worm carcasses and skeletons. What were they doing here? The landscape here, while still within the confines of the ship, albeit a massive one, are in stark contrast to what it was before. I was initially very skeptical about returning to the pyramid ship. We already had an epic raid battle in this location and have been getting our fill of darkness architecture and landscape for the last couple of years. I was concerned it would fall a bit flat aesthetically because of that. I was very happy, however, to see a unique blend, collision, and integration of the pyramid architecture with Savathun's throne world environment. The coalescence helps the dungeon feel like its own unique world and is much better off for it. And who can argue with giant Indiana Jones-inspired spiky balls? I think some of Bungie's best environmental storytelling has happened with darkness architecture. Vow of the Disciple was some of the peak of this in the ways Bungie actually showed what was happening in the story through how the encounter spaces were designed. I'm very happy to see this type of storytelling is still front and center here in Sundered Doctrine. Not only are we presented with a familiar but severely new play space, we also realize very quickly that there are many mysteries left to solve here inside the pyramid. After all, that is the majority portion of why our Guardian is summoned here in the first place. The Dread are looking for something. Having been called here by a yet unseen power, they are doing what they can to gain access to this mystery, as is evident in the final boss room. A massive, looming, dark red door. Knowing that Savathun is also involved here, at least as a bug in our ear for now, there is certain to be more mystery, deceit, truths, and lies involved. As with dungeons past, Bungie carefully constructs the encounter sequences to help teach the puzzle mechanics along the way. How much more puzzly can you get when the first encounter of the dungeon is literally called Solve the Riddle? This encounter, of course, teaches the foundational aspects of using the lenses and totems to rotate the resonant light around to hit their targets. A mechanic that gets used in 2 of the 3 encounters, as well as one of the interstitial traversal areas. Simple point and shoot, but first encounter makes it complicated in how you have to route that resonant light to each symbol. Lots of light bouncing and backtracking to ensure that you get each route correct. As could be expected for this dungeon as well, we were reintroduced to the symbols from the Vow of the Disciple raid. This time around, I did enjoy the symbol library that they carved out at the back of the first encounter for newcomers to those symbols to get to learn them before having to dive in. The rewarding part about this first encounter mechanic for the day one contest mode was that this was the timed encounter. Teams had a very short window to solve the first riddle and connect the light in order for time to be added on to help solve the next two light sequences. This was the kind of wrinkle to the mechanic I was hoping might persist in normal mode. That was one frustrating bit about the puzzle solving in this dungeon. It felt too forgiving. It has been a criticism of mine in past dungeons too that I think Bungie can still iterate on the balance between difficulty on first clear versus when I'm running through this dungeon for the 20th time. Combat difficulty is not always enough to set the urgency and lethality of a dungeon encounter. Grasp of Avarice had the Burden of Riches mechanic timer that would kill you if it reached 0. Duality had the Nightmare Collapsing timer that would do the same thing if you didn't bell teleport back in time. And even Ghosts of the Deep had puzzle mechanics in the Ekthar encounter that would immediately kill you if you shot the wrong symbol. The stakes in all of these cases seemed much higher, and it's something I'm desperately missing in the puzzle mechanics here. Even the most recent dungeon we had before this, Vesper's Host, had the viral debuffs for Scanner, Operator, and Suppressor. Those, plus the frickin' one-hit lightning at Corrupted Puppeteer, add up to a lot of lethality in the mechanics of the dungeon. Having all the time in the world to solve a puzzle is nice, but it makes for a very sedate encounter design. Aside from the enemies, there's no urgency or lethality here, and outside of contest mode, the enemies are arguably not very lethal. I'll get off my negativity soapbox here for the puzzle stuff. Just disappointing that it feels like it's repeated criticism in some respect. They get it right and then it drops off again. I don't have a good segue for the rest of this puzzle stuff, so we'll just get into it. In addition to lens rotating, we also get giant dinner plates full of vow symbols in second and third encounters, which I thought were a great way to incorporate them. It felt like a roller coaster with how the second encounter you had to worry about the rotation of your knowledge when you dunked it, only to have that mechanic removed in third encounter in favor of reverting to the simplicity of the solve the riddle encounter by simply adjusting the resonant light beams onto the plates. 1 step forward, 3 steps back. Perhaps this would have been too complex and onerous to include that part for the final boss, given that there were other puzzly mechanics there too. Speaking of, we get the callback to solve the riddle in the form of 2 statements presented to us in the symbol room for the boss encounter. The wrinkle here was that while we have been solving for truth up to this point, we now want to activate the lie. If you know, you know. Of all the symbol puzzling in this dungeon, I really appreciated Bungie leaning into the actual lore of Destiny to assist with faster solving of these puzzles. Even though they did include the accessibility of being able to kill the truth speaker enemies to clue you in on what symbols to chase, you can circumvent that feature entirely in the final encounter, at least, if you know your symbols and can spot the lie right away. Valuable time-saving buff, especially if you're running solo. While I normally don't take into account story content in my summarization of dungeons, as they don't always lend themselves to the primary seasonal or episodic story, here it seems like we're tied into the sudden appearance of the Dread in episode Heresy, and we're also getting a lore dump of the Dread themselves. Last little puzzle mechanic I'll mention simply because it exists has to do with the final boss encounter and the unwritten empowerment buff. Another little additive mechanic for the final fight in which you need to kill one of the unwritten attendant Dread enemies to get this buff that lasts for about 6 seconds, which allows you to shoot the strand entanglements off the lenses that you need to rotate to activate or deactivate the necessary symbols. The puzzle crossovers into combat mechanics are always nice to see. This also happened in the first encounter with the lenses, where you are required to kill the subjugators to drop the lenses. One reinforces the other. And with that, let's turn to the combat side of the equation. Sundered Doctrine features Hive and Dread throughout. And Dread, oh man, I've been waiting for a Dread-focused dungeon since the enemy race arrived at the beginning of the final shape. Content creator Mactix put it best by succinctly describing them as, quote, flying martyrdom bugs. No, truly, the flying grim enemies are some of the worst that this enemy race has to offer. But I mean that in the best way. Until the Dread were introduced, we didn't really have a flying enemy before. Shanks and Servitors don't count, they float. They certainly add to the chaos of the dungeon, and this combat experience helps get things engaging, since, as I mentioned earlier, the puzzle mechanics can't always pull their own weight either. The straight combat experience of Sundered Doctrine was tuned lower than Vesper's Host. The only time where I felt like that was not the case was in the second encounter, Zoetic Lock Set. But even in this encounter, the enemy density was only an issue with mismanaged puzzle mechanics. Even as I'm reading this, I'm realizing that the balance between combat triggering mechanics and vice versa in this dungeon is actually very well designed and reinforced throughout. All of that to say is Zoetic Lock Set only lives up to the combat prowess of something like the Rainix Unified encounter from Vesper's Host if you botch the symbol management and end up with a bunch of bad symbols spawning in ogres, knights, and all the other bad stuff, all while you're trying to DPS the locks. Rather than the combat being mandatory, you can skirt around it if you're up to it. A new idea in terms of dungeon design, for sure. Most combat experiences before have been pretty prescriptive with spawn timings and enemy types. I'll be curious to see if this is something they continue to explore in the future. The best combat metaphor I've seen for Guardians making their own fate. Stepping back quickly to the first encounter, I felt like this was just not enough enemy threat here, especially given that this was strictly a puzzle encounter with no boss. I'm leaning toward this being a balance issue for the contest mode, where, again, this encounter was timed, and they likely tuned the ad spawns and density to account for this additional challenge. However, in normal mode with a full fire team, there was very little engagement. Aside from entering the side rooms to murk the subjugators and swipe their lenses, the few husks popping up in the middle are just not enough to make it feel like a fight. It felt more like an annoyance. But again, combat was not really the focus here, and maybe that's why it felt this way. It's the foundational encounter to learn the mechanic. I feel like we had similar instances of this in Spire of the Watcher, in both the entrance and the tower scaling areas, where they just didn't feel like they were a lot of enemies. Needs more, says I. Third encounter felt like the best combat experience, partly because you are dealing with the final boss here, but also because of the unique zones of the encounter as you move through each room. One thing I think helped the combat experience in this encounter was the scale of the environment. I think where Zoetic Lock Set felt a little empty at times due to the size of the arena, the Karev encounter felt claustrophobic and dense with how you navigate from the main room to each side room and back again. Having fewer places to zoom off to in order to recover health or catch your breath lent to a more satisfying combat feeling. All enemies felt equally threatening, from the husk to the unwritten attendants to the boss itself. And boy, is Bungie doing a good job iterating on what a boss can be. For years, we heard complaints about these massive hitbox baddies standing still and getting melted by guardians in a well of radiance. Here we have a boss that is physically not much bigger than us. He runs and jumps and has an amazing grapple and suspend combo attack that just makes me excited writing about it now. I think this is one of the downfalls of Vesper's Host for me. The corrupted puppeteer was not directly threatening. The environment sure was, but I never usually found myself dying or in mortal danger from the boss attack directly. With Karev, you get hit by that suspend, and you're just floating there, clenched, hoping you don't get domed by all the other enemies in your proximity. It makes for a very unique boss DPS rotation, and while not the end of the world most of the time if you get bopped into the air, it does make you think twice about how you want to engage with the encounter and your approach to damage. Any boss that does this is fine by me. And what makes that combat experience feel even more rewarding? Loot. Sundered Doctrine comes with 4 new legendary weapons alongside the dungeon exotic. First, we have Unloved, a kinetic slot strand heavy burst hand cannon. This is the first primary weapon with hatchling in the third column, which enables some interesting perk combinations that are even entirely unique to this weapon, like hatchling plus elemental honing, or hatchling and paracausal affinity. Unsworn is a kinetic slot strand adaptive frame trace rifle. This has an interesting perk pool with some combinations like rewind rounds plus a new perk called Detonator Beam, which reads, dealing sustained damage creates an explosion around the target. This is also, I believe, the first trace rifle to roll with bait and switch. Maybe not a DPS meta that's coming anytime soon, but I can imagine this can add a bump to this weapon for orange bar enemies, perhaps. Unsworn, along with Unloved, the hand cannon, also have an interesting strand kind of wombo combo of tear plus hatchling. This probably makes more sense on the hand cannon since both of these perks proc from precision final blows, but doing so would cause nearby targets to become severed as well as spawning a threadling. Next up, we have Unworthy, an energy slot rapid fire frame arc scout rifle. This can roll with Rapid Hit or Firefly in the third column, and Volt Shot or Rolling Storm in the fourth column for some interesting arc bolt charge synergy. And finally, Unvoiced, an energy slot pinpoint slug frame void shotgun. This can roll with destabilizing rounds in the third column, which is really good this season due to the many amazing void artifact perks. It can also roll with redirection in the third column, which was actually buffed at the beginning of this episode, but was not originally included in the patch notes, and Bungie had to tweet out that correction. As a slug frame, this might be a more reasonable DPS option than the Trace, so the existence of bait and switch and even Vorpal in the fourth column could make sense. The new Void perk Demoralize also sits here in the fourth column, where precision final blows cause nearby targets to become weakened. The origin trait perk on all of these also adds to the fun. Subjugation, which reads, weapon adapts to targets. When dealing damage to weak targets, shots explode. To strong targets, targets become exhausted, where exhausted targets deal reduced outgoing damage. And to guardians, the weapon's flinch resistance increases. I have not been blessed by the RNG gods for many of these guns, so I'm looking forward to the continued grind to get some good drops here. The Strand's heavy burst hand cannon particularly looks appealing. The random drop exotic is Finality's Augur, a power slot solar linear fusion rifle with a very exotic looking perk that lets you consume ammo to deploy a turret that you can then use like an AC-130 to call down airstrikes on painted targets below. I can't go into too much detail on this one since I don't have it yet, but I'm sure you can imagine or just watch other YouTube videos about how fun this thing can be. Sundered Doctrine just felt like a solid Bungie Destiny gaming experience. The raid and dungeon team has really been cooking since the final shape with the latest raid plus these last two dungeons. You can tell they're mixing things up, they're trying things out for the first time, and making it all come together in spectacular fashion. I hope we continue to see this type of engaging environmental, mechanical, and combat design moving forward into the unknown future of Frontiers later this year. And I hope that I continue to see all of you around this channel for at least a little while too. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.